Picture a long, empty highway just after midnight. The city lights have faded in the rearview mirror, and ahead there is nothing but dark road and the soft glow of headlights cutting through silence. There is a person behind that wheel who left home with no particular destination. No GPS running, no podcast playing, just the hum of the engine, the rhythm of the road, and the quiet company of their own thoughts. To most people, this might look like restlessness. It might look like insomnia, or avoidance, or something vaguely concerning. But to the person driving, it feels like the only place in the world where thinking actually works. This behavior is more common than most people realize. All around the world, there are people who, when life becomes too heavy or too complicated, do not reach for their phone, do not call a friend, do not pour a drink. They get in their car and drive, sometimes for 1 hour. Sometimes for 3, sometimes until the fuel gauge nudges toward empty and forces them back to reality. They drive through neighborhoods they have never visited, along coastal roads at dusk, through empty industrial zones at 2 in the morning. The destination is never the point, the movement is. What makes a person choose a moving vehicle as their preferred space for deep thought? The answer begins with something psychologists call environmental psychology, the study of how physical spaces affect mental states. Research in this field consistently shows that certain environments lower psychological defenses and allow the mind to operate more freely. The car, for many people, represents one of the most psychologically unique spaces in modern life. It is private yet mobile. It is enclosed yet open to the world passing by the window. It belongs entirely to the driver, yet it exists in constant motion through public space. This combination creates a psychological condition that is genuinely difficult to replicate anywhere else. There is a man named Ethan, 34 years old, who works as a project manager in a large city. For years, whenever a major decision loomed over him, whether it was leaving a job, ending a relationship, or simply processing a difficult conversation he had at work, he would wait until the evening, get into his car, and drive for 2 or 3 hours with no music and no destination. He described it once to a close friend by saying that inside the car, his thoughts felt organized in a way they never did sitting at a desk or lying in bed. Something about the motion made everything clearer. His friend thought he was being strange, but what Ethan was describing has a real psychological basis. Neuroscientists have studied what happens to the brain during repetitive, low-demand physical activity, and the findings are striking. Activities like walking, swimming, and driving on familiar or empty roads engage just enough of the brain to keep the body occupied, while simultaneously freeing the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for higher thinking, planning, and self-reflection, to operate with unusual clarity. The brain enters a state researchers sometimes describe as transient hypofrontality, where the analytical, self-critical regions quiet slightly and creative, associative thinking flows more easily. This is why so many people report their best ideas arriving in the shower, on a walk, or behind the wheel. The mind needs a small amount of sensory input to stop spiraling inward, and driving provides exactly that calibration. But the psychology goes much deeper than neuroscience alone. For many people who drive alone to think, the car represents something that almost no other space in modern life can offer, which is genuine solitude without isolation. In an apartment, solitude can tip quickly into loneliness. In a public park, solitude is never entirely private, but inside a moving car, a person exists in a suspended state between the private and the public world. They are surrounded by other people, other lives, other stories visible through windows, yet entirely sealed from all of it. This creates a psychological container that feels both safe and stimulating at the same time. There is a woman named Layla, 28, who grew up in a large, loud household where privacy was almost impossible to find. She shared a room with 2 sisters, and the family home was always full of relatives, conversations, and noise. When she turned 18 and got her first car, she discovered almost by accident that driving alone in the evening gave her something she had been unconsciously craving for her entire childhood, a space that was entirely hers. A place where no one could interrupt her, where no one needed something from her, where time moved at her own pace. Now, years later and living in her own apartment, she still drives alone several nights a week, not because she lacks space at home, but because the car became her emotional sanctuary, and the habit of thinking clearly within it is now deeply wired into who she is. This points to one of the more profound psychological dimensions of this behavior, which is the concept of transitional space. The psychologist Donald Winnicott introduced this idea to describe environments that exist between the inner world and the outer world, spaces where a person can safely process emotion without being fully exposed to external demands. For many solo drivers, the car functions as precisely this kind of transitional space. Problems that feel overwhelming in a static environment become workable when viewed through a moving windshield. Grief that cannot be accessed in a quiet room somehow becomes approachable at 60 miles per hour on an empty road. The motion creates enough psychological distance from a problem to allow reflection without avoidance. Psychologists who study rumination, the tendency to replay difficult thoughts in repetitive and unproductive loops, have noted something interesting about this kind of solitary driving. Unlike sitting still with difficult thoughts, which often intensifies rumination, purposeful movement seems to interrupt the loop. The mind is given just enough new input, a changing landscape, a shifting road, the sensory rhythm of driving, to prevent thoughts from cycling destructively. The person ends up processing rather than ruminating, thinking rather than spiraling. This distinction is crucial, and it is one reason why solitary driving often leaves people feeling clearer rather than more anxious. The ritual nature of this behavior also deserves attention. For people who do this regularly, the act of getting into the car, adjusting the seat, pulling out of the driveway, and feeling the first few minutes of road beneath the wheels is not just preparation. It is the ritual itself. Psychologists understand that rituals serve a deeply important function in human psychology. They signal to the brain that a transition is happening, that one mode of being is ending and another is beginning. The solo drive becomes a signal to the nervous system that it is now safe to think, safe to feel, safe to be uncertain without consequence. Over time, the brain learns to drop its defenses the moment the car starts moving. Walk into any late-night diner situated along a highway and pay attention to the people who come in alone, order coffee, sit quietly for 20 minutes and then leave. Many of them just pulled off the road mid-drive. They are not necessarily troubled. They are simply in the middle of working something out, and they needed a brief pause before continuing. These solitary night drivers form an invisible community. They do not know each other. They never meet in any formal sense, but they share a particular relationship with movement and thought, a shared understanding that the road offers something that four walls cannot. There is a quiet solidarity in passing another car at 2 in the morning on an empty highway and wondering, briefly, whether that person is also out there thinking through something important. The philosophical dimension of this behavior reaches further still. In many ancient traditions, the journey itself was considered sacred. Pilgrims walked not just to reach a destination, but to be transformed by the act of moving toward it. The solo night drive carries an echo of this. The person behind the wheel is engaged in something that looks like transportation, but functions like pilgrimage. They are moving through physical space in order to move through psychological space. The road becomes a metaphor made literal. To keep driving is to keep engaging with the problem. To turn around and go home is to choose to stop thinking for now. The car gives the mind a physical action to mirror its internal process. People who drive alone for hours to think are not running away from their lives. They are running toward a version of themselves that is clearer, calmer, and more honest. They have discovered, perhaps without being able to fully articulate it, that the mind works differently in motion. That solitude inside a moving car is its own category of human experience, something that cannot be replaced by meditation apps or journaling or long walks, though those have their own value. The road offers something specific and irreplaceable. It offers forward movement without pressure. It offers privacy without loneliness. It offers silence that somehow still feels alive. The next time someone mentions that they went for a long drive alone to clear their head, resist the instinct to see this as avoidance or eccentricity. What they are actually describing is one of the more sophisticated self-regulatory behaviors a person can develop. They have found their space. They have found their method. And somewhere out there, on a dark road at an unreasonable hour, they are probably figuring out something important.